Hi class, welcome to Module 4. It's clear that sociology is not the only way to look at gender. So this chapter really deals with looking at other disciplines and how they look at gender. No surprise to you that psychology comes from the aspect of human behavior and mental health. It's interesting as we look at psychology, and we'll explore that a little bit deeper, but as psychology has been one of the main developers of the DSM, we've seen changes over time related to gender and how it was considered. At one point, being homosexual was considered a mental illness. And it was treated as such, and things have changed over time. So there's a lot of change that goes on in these, but we're going to go back and look at these theories. Now, family studies explores it through the role of family, and women's studies look as well at interdisciplinary approach. Women's studies actually looks at it through an interdisciplinary approach, as does family studies, but focused on family. So we see this whole difference of how we explore things. And then there are those that just totally focus on those gender issues. I'm not going to review a lot here by writing a chapter summary as I've tried to do for the last chapter. But I'm going to go through it with your PowerPoints and touch on some things. I've also given you some reading because I think it's hard to grasp some of these theories, especially queer theory. I think it's very difficult. And again, even though I don't believe in Wikipedia for a lot of things, I think you will find these two Wikipedia references on queer theory and gender theory in general will help bring together the thoughts that are presented as you read this chapter. Now, let's look at those PowerPoints and see where we're at. So let me pull this screen down a little if it will come. And I don't know if it will do that. But how do disciplines outside sociology study gender? Well, first of all, let's look that sociology perspective on gender is really clarified by contrasting it with other with other disciplines. Disciplines like psychology and economics will focus on different areas than we do in sociology. What's neat about the sociological perspective is you're going to see that, especially women's studies and family studies, gravitate to these sociological influences. And you can see that pulled up as well when we go into practice areas such as social work and education as they try to understand gender. So disciplines use different conceptual approaches for examining gender. So we look at the attributes of gender, or we look at those social characteristics, or we look at mental health issues, or we look at how people function as individuals and how they see themselves. So let's look at the psychological approach. Obviously, one of the big areas of gender study. Psychologists are most interested in the individual, and they focus on the process related to the mind and the brain. Now, there's a video that we'll probably be watching down the road that really shows that there's this biology piece and psychological piece that our brains actually function differently. You know, men's and women's brains do function differently. When women are given a problem and they're in a PET scan where you can see what the brain is doing, their whole brain lights up. And it stays lit up, and they work on this problem both sides. When we give it to men, the same problem, in the majority of cases, and remember there are always outliers for any of these examples, in the same case that men, brain will light all up, and then only a small portion of it continues to be lit up, the part working on the problem. You see, there are reasons both psychologically and biologically, that men and women are different. And so when we look at those psychological approaches, we can go back to the original works out there of Freud, who looks at the particular issues related to women. Now, let me get my notes here and talk a little bit about Freud. Now, remember that Freud is early on writing. He's also writing after the early sociologists are writing out there, but he's looking at how people function, and they're really going into that dynamic issue of understanding the individual. And he focuses on how children unconsciously make sense of their anatomical differences, and he looks at the Oedipus complex of how children develop their masculine and feminine issues. Now, when we look at the Oedipus complex, it is how men develop that sense of their masculine identity, and boys develop this concern about being castrated in the process, according to the definition here, and they fear castration from their own fathers. Okay? Now, to move on with some of these issues, we see that psychology, especially Freud, focused on the fact that men had the power, their relationship, and women faced this penis envy approach. That women were successful then in possessing a penis when they possessed a man in their lives or they had a baby. And that there was this true need to become masculine in the process and have that difference. Now, I think it's important, and our book doesn't really talk about it, that we go back to some of other pieces of Freud. As he brought us the id, the ego, and the superego, and understanding the process. And if we look at those pieces to understand who we are, it gives us a better look than necessarily looking at those gender issues. Now, let's look at a few other approaches here. But sex difference research is a big part of psychology. Notice I jumped through some of the slides as you look here, but it's a big part of understanding the differences. So psychology really focuses in many situations on looking at the difference. Now, remember when I say this is a broad talk about psychology, some of you are psychology majors, and I don't want to forget that there's a significant piece of psychology that looks at the social issues as well. That's why we have social psych, where our disciplines cross each other at so many levels. And so someone who is focused on social psych will be teaching very similar things to what we will go into in this class as we look at those social issues, but hopefully enough away from it. But the difference is to take that away. So these four important takeaway ideas. The task of established sexual differences is complex and difficult. That's not a surprise to any of us who have dealt with our gender. It has implications beyond the realms of research, that it makes a difference whether you're a girl or boy at school, in the workplace, and we can really start seeing how those psychological issues come into place. It is a descriptive research. It identifies whether or not differences exist, but we can't always explain the causes. And it introduces important questions. What is the connect between the differences and the inequality? Okay. Anthropology, a subject that comes out of sociology. Cultural anthropology and sociology both study social life. However, anthropologists focus more on how societies interact in their physical environment. So they study societies different. They gather the information different. They, for many years, focus mainly on ethnographic studies. They have moved more and more to qualitative and quantitative type research that we are currently doing. In fact, I know some anthropologists that strictly do quantitative research today, but they still have this base of examining gender as defined and interacted across societies. And so what they're looking at is these different societies. Now, Margaret Mead and her student Franz Boas really looked at this cross-cultural research to understand. And what they found in looking through the process was the behaviors that are common to different cultures based on gender. And they looked a lot at hunter and gatherer societies, and they saw the man as the hunter and the woman as the gatherer in most of these models, but not always the case. And so more recent feminist anthropologists have identified a problem with this hunter and gatherer look. They've also, in the past, looked at societies, especially for the issues of patriarchal, I'm sorry, to pop that ahead, what did mean, to the difference between patriarchal and matriarchal societies. And in their studies, they have found almost no dominant matriarchal societies, that it tends to be either an egalitarian or a patriarchal situation where men are in charge. So there's this understanding of what has come into place, and then trying to give that look at what's different in the process. Now, a general theory out there is queer theory. Now, queer theory argues that the conventional approach to psychology, anthropology, and sociology are all privileged science and objective. And queer theory begins with a deep suspicion of the current intellectual discourse. In other words, they question everything that's going on, and they look to try to understand without necessarily putting that strong research behind. I find queer theory very difficult to understand. So this breakdown on the PowerPoint helps us just put it into thought. There were three main movements: the gay and the lesbian rights movement, and they're based in some of those historic pictures, the Stonewall riots, and the removal of homosexuality from the disorders of the DSM. So this is important pieces. You see that part of the queer theory is based on the social movements that are going on, and even in this case, the understanding by psychology of some different stance related to sex and gender. The postmodern period moves forward and it challenges that assumption about the unified homosexual identity, that everybody's the same. You know, there was this breakdown that you were either butch or dyke if you were a lesbian, and yet that's not the case as we start to break down and understand what goes into place. And so there is a new look at it, and they reject this comprehensive putting people into categories. And finally, the third movement is the feminist movement that said that we needed to look at things at a different level, and we needed to look at things through an egalitarian stance. Now, remember what feminist is. It's not that radical feminism that we're talking about. We're talking about a look at all different issues related to gender differentiation as equal, and that comes in the process. So queer theory does not aim to solve all the problems of the other theories. It really is there to lead to discussion. It isn't even there to dig at deeper levels of research. It is to give us that meta narrative to look at sex and gender in a different light. So the three key features of queer theory are: queer theorists are distrustful of other categories and putting people into categories. They think of the categories of an identity as open and fluid, and they aim to queer many features of academic and social life that are bound by normalcy. I've given you that link to the Wikipedia to explain queer theory at a more breakdown level, give you kind of that approach. Now, evolutionary psychology and sociobiology are theories that look to adopt that more biosocial approach. The difference that there is that biological, that lighting up of the brain I was talking about, and they argue that social behaviors are outcomes of human evolutionary development and adaptation, that things have changed over time and that's how they come into place. Interesting as we start to explore those theories. Why are we talking about these outside theories? Why does the textbook author include these things? Because they are important to understand that there are different approaches to look at things. That's why you take sociology. That's why you take psychology. That's why you take women's studies. That's why you take economics, because they show you those different perspectives within the social science. Speaking of economics, let's jump down to economics, gender economics and development. And so here we look at these theories as far as the pressure on groups based on their gender inequality in the colonial period. We look at the modernization theory and how the post-colonial world could become more developed. We look at the changes from the economic perspective, and then we look at the economic problems that women face today in relationship to work and economy and moving forward. So, using theory. I love how they say don't panic. Use these theories to raise some interesting questions, excuse me, about what gender is and how it works. So, does it make sense? I don't even know if any of these can clearly understand why individuals perform differently and why societies in certain places require women or men to behave in certain manners. But you can see the culture and the society coming forward, and as we try to drop these into theories, it really gets bogged down. It really gets mucky out there in trying to understand it. So try not to get bogged down in too much conflict and just learn that they're out there. Now, obviously, for this class, you well know that we won't spend a lot of time. You're not doing a major research paper that includes theory. You're going to be looking at gender issues, and you could choose theory as part of that. But don't get bogged down in the theory, but understand that these perspectives help us to understand society a little better. All right, let's go back to your module here. As I warned you in the last module, you would have 2 movies because I could not fit them in because that other movie was so long in the last module. These 2 movies are the are PBS movies that have come out very recently, so they're very current, about the awakening and the changing of the women's movement, and then the change of the world makers, women who made America. Now, I want us to come back to men's issues, and we will do that. I apologize that these are so focused on women's issues at this point, but understanding the woman's issue helps you understand where the man's issue comes into this place. So you have a discussion board, and your discussion board is on theory, but the question of the week, if you choose to answer this particular one, is from the chapter, and it is number 6 and chapter 3. Is the one that I'm asking you to answer, which is not theory driven, but allows you to think about that theory as you explore the topic. With that said, have a great week. Let me know when you have questions, please.